This deals with one of the two subjects that young Earth creationists are the most despised, hated, and ridiculed for. If we would simply give up on the fact that the world is young and of the fixity of the kinds, that each kind does not change into something else, we could be perfectly acceptable to secular science. The problem is, as you're going to see tonight, not only does the scientific evidence fit with a young Earth, the Bible refers to a young Earth. Let's start with the Bible. 2 Peter 3:8 and 9 said, with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like a day. Was the Bible really defining one of God's days as 1,000 years? Or is this thing really saying God is outside of time? To God, time is not a constraint, and really the thrust of this scripture was about the fact that He wanted to give time to where no one came to a point of not being saved. How old is the Earth? How old would you want the Earth to be? Because there's a lot of people who want to call it different things. 4.6 billion years? Well, we spent a whole 40-minute session showing you that radiometric dating does not establish this world as 4.6 billion years old. The question is, how old is it? Because all we did was negate that is not proof for 4.6 billion. 6,000 years? Some people, such as Usher, suggested that our world is that old. 260 million, I throw that one out because that's how long it would take for the world's oceans to get as salt as they are based on the amount of salt that's running off in rivers and running off of our continents into the oceans right now. I can show you data for any date you want, even 100 years or 1,000 years. There's data that shows that. Again, radiometrics don't prove anything. We've shown you that they really depend upon index fossils. Why a young Earth? Because again, as I said, we could make our life as creationists a whole lot simpler if we would just compromise with secular science. The chronologies in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Luke suggest a 6,000-year history. We're now talking about biblical authority, folks. Either the Bible knows what it's talking about or it doesn't. What we've had is a whole lot of theologians for 150 or more years who have been running from this topic when they really didn't need to. If the Earth is young, then there's no possibility whatsoever for evolution to occur since it requires huge amounts of time. Now, the real truth is you can give the evolutionists any amount of time they want. For example, if they want a 17 billion-year-old Earth, give it to them. Evolution is still mathematically impossible to have occurred on this planet. In 17 billion years. Forget 4.6 billion. Old or young Earth, which does the data support? Let's show you some scientific evidence on this point. I'm going to open with the most complicated set of data, and then we'll get easy from that point forward. I start with the most difficult simply because we're going to get it out of the way, but second, because this truthfully is some of the most startling. Polonium halos is a field from Dr. Robert Gentry, who is the leading authority on paleochloric halos in the world. He used to be a worker at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. Now, he specializes in radioactive breakdown of material in rocks. His work has showed variation in decay rates by differing halo sizes, and I'm going to give you examples of what that looks like in just a moment. He has also discovered one isotope of polonium that has a 1/10,000 second half-life, and I'm going to show you why that's important in just a second. Here is the complex way that uranium decays into one element after another until it decays into lead. Now notice a couple of times in here there's something that keeps showing up. What is that? Polonium. Some isotopes of polonium decay in only like 3 minutes, but some of them decay in a 10,000th of a second. That's what's really interesting, and we're going to show you that. Polonium halos, and I'm going to show you what I'm really meaning by a halo in a minute, they form very often in fluorite or mica. They have no uranium halos in some rocks. And the current theory is you have uranium, which is deposited when it comes out of magma, out of a lava pit or whatever. The uranium decays into polonium, as you saw on that long list just a moment ago, and then eventually into lead. Now, every time these things give off a beta or alpha particle, they scar the rock. on a microscopic level. And you can actually see where that scarring of the rock occurs. So we can see when the uranium decayed into thorium, and then thorium into protactinium, and practinium into polonium, etc. However, the interesting thing is, when you look at a uranium-238, we see this halo which shows this uranium decaying into another substance. This is a polonium halo, which is, you'll notice, is a very different type of halo, a very different scarring in the rock. What Gentry found was polonium halos in rocks without uranium halos. What this means is, in this rock, this polonium was formed so quickly that it did not have time to decay from uranium to polonium. It was made as polonium. Now remember again, the half-life of this polonium is what? 1/10,000th of a second. What you're seeing are rocks that show they were instantaneously created. According to Earth secular science, this is all supposed to be what? This is supposed to be a world that coalesced over hundreds of millions of years from dust and magma and all that kind of stuff. But what did God say He did? He said He did it in 6 days, but how long did it take Him to form all the stuff for the universe? Instantly. Ooh, this fits into what He's saying. This gives us evidence that there were rocks that did not cool out of magma, did not coalesce over hundreds of millions of years, but were instantaneously made. Because we see evidence in rocks that could only form if they were formed in that specific isotope and only existed for a short period of time. Yes, sir?
How did the secular scientists explain that?
They fired him.
I'm sorry?
They fired him.
How would a secular scientist?
They do not have good evidence for this. They put up with Gentry for about a decade with this evidence out there, and incidentally, he's had 3 great contributions to this field. But when he testified at the Arkansas balanced treatment case, a law in Arkansas had been put forward that if you teach evolution, you've also got to teach creation in the public schools. That, of course, was sued, and it came to a trial. When he testified for the creation side, saying, hey guys, we've got evidence from my work that shows, 1, that the world was created in an instant, 2, that decay rates are not constant, therefore you can't trust radiometric dating, and 3, shows that coal can be formed in a very rapid period of time. It does not take millions of years. The reaction was this guy who was the leading authority on paleochloric halo in the world was fired immediately from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. That was their response. In addition to Gentry's work, we have this interesting stuff. In zircons, there are crystals found in the earth which can change color when interacting with temperature or water. Several of these ancient zircons show early interaction with water, suggesting the early earth was not magma for 500 million years. You know, that's the idea of the evolutionists, is that a bunch of rocks and dirt came together to form the earth, and it all really impacted together, making a molten planet that cooled over time. What we see in these zircons buried deep in the earth is a suggestion that the early earth was not molten, was not Hadean as they call it, but was formed in cool water. Wait a minute, that's what the Bible says, that everything came out of what? Water. The entire universe, in fact. Other results of Gentry's work, we have these different decay rates. Remember that when we were looking at radiometric dating, it was based upon if the uranium decays into lead in 4.5 billion years. Incidentally, has there been anybody around for 4.5 billion years to measure it? No, they're looking at the last 100 years of decay, and they're saying this is how much decayed in that period of time, and they're going to extrapolate over the next 4.5 billion years. Is that an extremely small sample?
Yes.
It is. However, if they're correct, then they have a measuring clock. The problem is what Gentry's work showed, because even for polonium or uranium, the halos would differ in size, showing that the decay rates over time have not been constant. Well, if you don't have a constant decay rate, do you have a clock that you can measure by? No, it's out the window. His work in coal in Utah shows the following, that coal was recently formed. And I'll show you some evidence of why it was recently formed in a little while. His research has also showed that coal was inundated with water and irradiated by leaching prior to coalification. Why would it be inundated by water if it was part of the flood? That also could have been it was just in peat bogs or marshes. But notice this, his data also showed that it was compressed prior to coalification. That is not part of the secular theory of coal formation. The secular theory is you have these peat bogs in which all this material gets down at the bottom of the lake and forms this biomass, which eventually slowly gets covered over. But if it's compressed prior to coalification, that says that all this stuff was rapidly thrown on top of it. Ooh, again, what does that better fit into? That fits into a flood geology. This all fits well within the biblical flood event and a young earth scenario. Okay, as I said, we just went through the toughest stuff to visualize tonight. Now let's take some stuff that's a little easier to see. And here's Tracy's topic. We're going to talk about helium in the upper atmosphere. Naturally, uranium and thorium, which we know is buried in the ground, decays and gives off helium. If this world is actually 4.6 billion years old, not only has uranium being decaying into lead in the ground, it's been giving off helium. That's a byproduct of that decay process. If that process has been going on for 4.6 billion years, there ought to be a huge store of helium in the upper atmosphere. In the 1950s, they sent balloons up into the upper atmosphere to measure all of the gases in the upper atmosphere, and one of them was helium. What they found that this huge store of helium is not up there. The evolutionists immediately theorized that what was happening was the helium was so light that it would get activated by solar radiation up here and actually get so active that it would bounce off into space, that we were losing the helium just hurling itself out into space. What we found when we got satellites up there was, while there is a very minor amount of loss of helium floating out into space, we are gaining more from what's called solar wind. The sun actually gives off a huge stream of particles out into space, and part of that hits the Earth. And guess what is one thing that's in that solar wind? Helium. We are gaining more helium from the sun than we are losing to outer space. So that got rid of their idea for where this stuff could be going. When you calculate the assumption of how much uranium is down here in the Earth and how much we think is decaying so far, and then see how much helium is actually up here in the upper atmosphere, the amount of time that it would take to fill the upper atmosphere with that much helium is somewhere between 6,000 and 175,000 years. Is that a time frame that fits within the biblical model? It is. But it's one that doesn't fit anywhere near the evolutionary model. Further, when they started doing analysis of zircons in the ground, they started to find that our ground contains the amount of helium that you would think is down there based upon our assumptions of how much uranium is in the ground. Which means it's not in the upper atmosphere, but we think we're correct about how much uranium is buried down in the Earth because the saturations of helium are down here, they're not up here. What does that mean if the saturations of helium are working their way through the ground, but they're not up here yet? They haven't had time to get there. They simply haven't had time to get there. Again, this is great young Earth evidence. It's terrible for the evolutionary community. How long did it take God to create time? Dad starts thinking, well, for starters, millions of years is definitely not an option. Depletion of the Earth's magnetic field. Current data says that our magnetic field is decaying with a half-life of 1,400 years. This is not disputed data. This is data that both creationists and evolutionists work off of. Our magnetic field that surrounds the Earth is getting weaker by about half every 1,400 years, which means 1,400 years ago it was twice as strong as it is today. And this is data from very different people, Gauss being one of them back in the 1830s, that have traced as our magnetic field has been declining. This is just a fact of the data that we've been looking at. Depletion of the Earth's magnetic field. If we extrapolate back 10,000 years, based on the data we have right now, the Earth would have had to start with a magnetic field equivalent to our sun. It probably was never that strong. The evolutionists propose a uniform cyclical event. What they propose is that there have been multiple times in history where the magnetic field has gotten weaker, 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 and then it reversed to where the North Pole now becomes the South Pole. And then it gets stronger over a period of millennia, and then it does what? Weakens again and reverses itself. As evidence for this, they point to what's called polarity reversion in some rocks. You can find some rocks across the Earth in which they are misaligned. That is, you'll find whole fields in an area where they're actually aligned to where their north points where? South, magnetically, in terms of magnetic polarity. Problem is, you don't have to have a reversal of the whole Earth's magnetic field to get that. What if there's a nice lodestone in the area around that field of lead or something else that would attract it? Guess what it does to everything in that field? It reverses the polarity of the thing. So, while they'll point to that, is there any evidence in our lifetimes or in the lifetimes of scientists who have recorded data of us ever seeing a total reversal? No. Again, they will point to seafloor data that shows possibly different alignments of that. That could be due to long millennia of these reversals, but it also could be due to the thought that during the flood, was there a great upheaval in the Earth? There was. And with all the tectonic action that was going on, could there have been a rapid reversal in terms of north-south polarity during an unstable time for the Earth? And incidentally, that's what we see in the seafloor. We see a whole group of magma that came out on the seafloor that is pointing north in terms of magnetism. Then we see another whole group of seafloor that's pointing where? South magnetically. And it's layered, one after another after another. Evolutionists say, well, this shows billions of years of time as this stuff came out and the things were reversed. Creationists come back and say, no, that was a rapid spread that occurred during the flood times when the continents were rapidly separated, and it also shows that the Earth's magnetic field was in a huge state of flux at that period. So while they do suggest that, we have a ready answer for that one.
Is the polarity shifting though? Slightly? I've noticed that we're actually renumbering some of the runways because they're based off of magnetic heading. And the magnetic heading of the runway is shifting.
It moves. It moves. That magnetic north is not perfect. It does move. But what they're talking about is not some shifting by half a degree or anything like that. They are talking about a complete reversal. Again, that's something that there is some evidence for, but not conclusive evidence. We don't know that. Okay, size and frequency of comets. Comets are a great source within our solar system of showing that this solar system, and therefore the Earth that's part of it, are very young. Comets, of course, what they do is they, like Halley's, go way out in the outer part of our solar system and then return. What happens when they get close to the sun? They start evaporating. They start giving off water and dust. And after they've made multiple passes, what happens? They actually disintegrate because there's only so much material in them. Calculations show that any of our comets, even Halley's, could not have existed for more than 10,000 years or they'd simply be out of material at this point. If you're going to go with the uniformitarianism idea that these comets have been in existence since the formation of the solar system 5 billion years ago, you would have had to have comets that started twice as big as what? Jupiter. Do you think they were ever that size? Yes.
Again, you would have to know the constant decay rate.
You would have to know the constant decay rate. And all we can do is make assumptions on when these comets come in and how often we see them. Many comets, what they call short period comets, we see every 10 to 15 years. Some of them are much more long period, like Halley's, which is what, every 78 years or something of that nature. Something of that nature. Again, it never could be that they could be larger than Jupiter. What do the evolutionists say to this kind of stuff? Well, they theorize there's an Oort cloud out there. That weird name is because there's a guy named Oort who theorized this. Is feeding us new comets, that way out in space beyond our solar system somewhere, there are places where some debris gets affected by the orbit of another star or something, it gets bumped into our solar system, and so occasionally we get a new comet. And so it feeds us new comets. And here's a picture of our solar system with this debris field outside called the Kuiper Belt, and then outside of the Kuiper Belt is the Oort cloud. Here's a problem. That's all theory. They have never observed the Oort cloud. Now that does not stop them from drawing incredibly beautiful pictures. Here's a picture of our solar system with the orbit of Pluto drawn, because Pluto is supposed to be what's called a Kuiper Belt object. It's supposed to just be an icy planetoid moon that's way out there, and beyond the Kuiper Belt where we have these icy bodies, there's supposed to be this Oort cloud. Again, is this a true picture taken by a satellite, or is this artwork? This is artwork. We have never observed anything out here in this supposed Oort cloud region. The idea that anything is getting bumped into our solar system is pure theory, pure speculation, and there is no data to support it. In point of fact, mathematically, this Oort cloud cannot exist. There are 100 different ways that people think they made our solar system, or that the solar system made itself. The most popular one today is called the nebular theory, that just a whole bunch of dust, gas, rocks, and junk came together, swirled together, and made the sun and the planets. The problem is that for you to get these Oort cloud bodies, which all seem to be icy, they would have had to be thrown out of the outer half of that swirl of dust and gas. To do that, they would have to be thrown at such velocities that these icy bodies would have absolutely been destroyed and dispersed. So mathematically, you can't even get an Oort cloud out of the current nebular theory. As I showed you last time, what is the simple freshman physics problem that comes out of the work of Dr. Slusher in UTEP? The force of hydrogen gas to force itself away from each other, what's called vapor pressure, is 40 times greater than gravitational pressure to attract atoms to each other. The question is, how could you ever, it's not that yes, once you get to a critical mass of the size of an asteroid, it starts to get enough gravity to collect itself. But you can never get to the point of that size object by itself without something forcing it together.
But doesn't the nucleus of a hydrogen atom, it's positive and the electrons are negative, and they pretty well neutralize each other?
In terms of in the innermost workings of that atom, true, but not in terms of attraction for different atoms. Different atoms have attraction to one another. That is called gravitational force. However, there is also vapor pressure which forces them apart. Whichever one is stronger is going to win, and the vapor pressure is 40 times stronger than the gravitational pressure.
And Scott, we've never gone into space and gone past Pluto?
No, well, in point of fact, not quite true. We just, a year or two ago, got one of our Voyager spacecraft that actually got outside of what we call the Pluto range and outside of our supposed solar system.
Did they see that belt?
No. No. All right. Recent creation of our solar system. Dr. Russell Humphrey used biblical model of science to predict things about our solar system. He said, okay, I'm a Bible believer. I'm also an astronomer. I'm going to believe the Bible when what it said 100%. I'm believe that the whole universe was created out of water ex nihilo, and it was created in the last 6,000 to 10,000 years. If that's true, I'm going to make some predictions based upon that of what we should find in space. And he did this before we ever sent out spacecraft to these different places. His predictions were that we should find magnetic field strengths on Uranus and Neptune, and he predicted how strong those magnetic fields would be for those two planets. Now, the predictions of secular scientists were they're so old, they're so cold, they should have no magnetic field whatsoever. Dr. Humphreys not only predicted based upon the fact that, or based upon the theory that they were created in the last 6,000 to 10,000 years and they were created out of water from the start, that they should have not only a magnetic field but a certain strength of magnetic field. Guess what they found when Voyager got to these two planets? They not only had magnetic fields, they had magnetic fields at the strength level that Dr. Humphreys predicted. Mercury has a magnetic field. It was predicted it should not have. It has what's called a remnant magnetic field, which Humphreys predicted, and the secular scientists said, no, it shouldn't have. He predicted that Mars would have a remnant magnetic field, which it does, which occurs when rocks solidify in the presence of a magnetic field. Again, secular scientists believe Mars is what? Old, cold, and dead, 5 billion years old, and that any remnant magnetism should be long gone. The fact that it still has remnant magnetism gives good evidence for the fact that it's quite young. If the planets were billions of years old, then these magnetic fields should either be very weak or completely gone. This is just one example of 38 different scientific proofs of a young solar system that are contained in a film that I have over there that will be available tonight called What You Aren't Told About Astronomy. And this is done by Spike Passaris, who was a former worker at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Folks, it's amazing the amount of evidence out there for not only a young Earth, but a young solar system, but you will never find it in a public school classroom. But you'll find it in this video. Coal and oil formation. Evolutionists believe that oil took millions of years to develop underground. Well, there's a lot of problems with that idea that it took millions of years to develop oil. One is this. Let's say it did take millions of years to develop. Under pressure, because what happens when you drill down and hit oil? You get a gusher because it's under intense pressure. Well, some simple mathematics shows that that pressure is not pushing against something that will never give way. If that rock is under that kind of pressure for thousands or millions of years, guess what it does? It cracks and gives it up. And in point of fact, we see that occasionally. You actually see oil coming up through the ground because the subterranean bedrock has given up. What we've done by simple calculations is found out that all the bedrock down there that is currently holding oil reserves in there could not hold that kind of pressure for greater than 10,000 years. That all of them would give way, which says what about those coal reserves? All of them are less than 10,000 years old. You've been taught through secular science that it takes millions of years to form coal. Because the normal secular idea is you have all this vegetable matter that goes into a swamp, gets buried, and then over millions of years through temperature and pressure is turned into coal. Well, what we found in experiments in a laboratory is you can take marine and vegetable matter made into high-grade oil in just 20 minutes if you put the right catalyst, and that's a chemical that you inject to make the process go. Incidentally, this catalyst is a chemical that is all throughout magma in volcanoes we see. So it's a naturally occurring chemical that we will see in the earth. You bury it, give it higher temperature and pressure. Incidentally, is that what happens when vegetable matter gets buried underneath a lava flow of some type? You automatically get temperature and pressure. And so it is very, very likely that we could get high-grade oil made in a very short period of time naturally. It does not take millions of years.
Or you could get that pressure by tectonic plate movement too.
You certainly could. Well, interesting thing. We have now done data that shows you don't even need pressure. All you need is temperature and the right catalyst, and you get high-grade oil in a very short period of time. New conclusions of coal and oil deluge. Dinos, vegetation, and animal beds buried catastrophically. If there was a huge amount of this biomass that was buried in a flood, would that give us the type of areas that would create coal in a very short period of time? It would. So the catastrophic things described in the Bible also describe how we could get most of our coal and oil formations. What's really interesting is when you dig down into some of this coal and oil, but especially coal, what have we found buried in coal? Well, we found gold chains. Do you really think that there was some kind of disco dino that was, had his gold chains on when he was doing the discos? No. What do those gold chains indicate in coal? Human presence. Human presence. We even found this bell buried deep in a coal deposit. Do you think that was dinosaur made? No way. This shows human presence, and this shows that these coal deposits, just like Dr. Gentry's work, show that this coal has been made in a very short period of time recently. And now we're finding even that abiogenic coal, that it does not take biomass to make oil. I'm not talking about coal now, I'm talking about oil. We found this out from the North Sea. The North Sea had one of the biggest oil reserves that was first found. And for a period of time, they thought that the North Sea oil reserves were all depleted. But they're now being replenished. And they said, ooh, wait a minute, where's this oil coming from? Because we thought we had sucked all the oil out of the North Sea. Well, for a while, they thought they were getting it from reserves that were giving way under cap rock from Europe. They disproved that. And now what they're finding is there actually is oil that's being produced in the mantle and seeping up. Again, does this challenge the normal, what's normally taught, that you have to have a whole lot of biomass that's buried for millions of years to produce oil? It does. The earth does reproduce some amount of oil. We don't know how much of it is biomatter and how much of it is what they call abiogenic, made by the earth from different chemicals in the mantle. But again, could that have all formed very recently? We have good data to show that. Nickel on the earth. Moon dust, like meteors, reveal a high nickel content. What that tells us is a lot of the meteorites that are hitting the moon, hitting the earth, are full of a lot of different substances, but one of them that there's a lot of is nickel. Meteors hit the earth. The earth should be many times as rich as it is in nickel. The question is, why isn't there a huge amount of nickel sitting on top of the earth if it's been bombarded with all these meteors for 4.6 billion years? Well, if you ask the evolutionists that, they'll say, well, it's really been washed off the earth into our oceans. And we're going to take that one for a moment. But before I do, let's just measure the amount of nickel that we see on the surface of the earth, the top 10 feet of earth crust. If you take that amount and calculate it based upon the amount of meteors that we see hitting the earth now for the last 100, 200 years, it calculates out that that amount of nickel is equivalent to guess what form? What number? 10,000 years. It's weird how that number keeps coming up. Evolutionists suggest the nickel is carried into the oceans by river runoff. Well, if all the nickel that has ever hit the earth from meteors has been running off into the oceans, what we should have then is 960 pounds of nickel per square foot on the ocean bottom. Guess what? Is there any of... You're shaking your head. There is no such store of nickel down there. Why? Because the earth is simply not that old. It has not been bombarded by meteors for 4.6 billion years. And this is great evidence of that. There's only been an accumulation that is equivalent to about 10,000 years. Ocean salinity. Mineral deposits in oceans much less than 3.5 billion years levels would predict. It would not take 3.5 billion years, which is how long they think our oceans have been here since the earth cooled, and then we got water from comets, which is another problem I'll talk about in a moment. But they would think that it would take 3.5 billion years for that water to get as salty as it is. Well, problem is, the amount of salts that are running off of rivers into the oceans, it would only take about 260 million years to get as salty as they are today, but that's based upon our current erosion rates. What if the flood occurred? Would there be a huge amount of minerals deposited into water during that time? And if the flood occurred, does that number all of a sudden go down to 10,000 years or less? It does, because there was a big event that changed the amount of mineral content in the water. As I've told you before, there are all different types of things. Aluminum, we could get to the amount of aluminum in water in just 100 years, so really that's an outlier. Magnesium would take about 45,000 years, but what if there was a flood? Could we have gotten there much quicker? We could have. Silicon, about 8,000 years. Potassium, we could get the amount of potassium we see in seawater in 11 million years, but again, if there's a flood, guess what? That goes down to under 10,000. Copper, we could get the amount of copper we see in 50,000 years in seawater. Gold, there actually is gold diluted or dissolved in seawater that would take about 560 million years to see that much in there. Silver, 2,100,000. Mercury, 42,000. Lead, it would take about 2,000 years to get what we see in there. tin, it would take about 100,000 years to see the amount of tin that's dissolved in seawater. This will make you not want to swallow seawater, thinking about what all is dissolved in the seawater when you go down there. Nickel, there's actually some nickel content in seawater. It would take about 18,000 years to get it all dissolved. But here's the point. There's 2 points that come out of this. Number one, what's wrong with these numbers from an evolutionist point of view? They should be much older, and they're not. Now, from a creationist point of view, they'll take these numbers and say, wait a minute, you're telling me that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, but potassium says it took at least 11 million to get that much potassium. Again, they want to take a completely uniformitarian process. They want to say that the amount of erosion we see today is all that there's ever been. But again, what big event? The flood would change all of these numbers. Rotation of the Earth. The Earth's rotation is slowing. Right now it's rotating at about 1,000 miles per hour at the equator. At this rate, it should have stopped long ago by evolutionary timescale. If it was only, say, 20 or 30 or 40 miles per hour faster 4.6 billion years ago, at the rate we see it slowing today, it should have already stopped. And that would be catastrophic for the Earth in terms of its ecosystem if it did. If we extrapolate back, because we see the Earth's rotation slowing in a very, very small extent right now. If we extrapolate back the amount of decay in that rate that we see over the last 4.6 billion years, the Earth would have been spinning so fast that it would have flattened itself out as a pancake. Is it a pancake Earth at this point? No, it's a round globe. It has a slightly pear shape to it. It's not perfectly round, but it's certainly not pancake-like. The current speed of rotation and speed of rotational decay is consistent with, guess what? About 10,000 years. It's very acceptable within that time frame, but not 4.6 billion. And we know the Earth is round. We've had spacecraft out there that have seen it. And in point of fact, this shot, a famous shot taken by Apollo 8 as they circled the moon, what was this? Christmas Eve, 1968. I always love that because what did they do on Christmas Eve? They read from the Bible from space on that night. But of course they had some people who were telling them, hey, that Earth's not round, it's flat. I always love this picture out of NASA, which has nothing to do with science, but has everything to do with men's perception. The recession of the moon. Recession means the moon is actually moving away from us. The moon is much too close to the Earth for 4.6 billion years. At its present recession rate, the moon is moving away from us at 3.8 centimeters per year, about an inch or so. Now, how can we be so definite about such a fine calculation? When Apollo 11 first landed, they put a parabolic reflector on the moon. We have been bouncing lasers off of that reflector for the past 40 years. During that 40-year period, have we gotten a real good gauge on exactly how far the moon is from us at any given time? We have. And we've been able to exactly plot its apogee and perigee, which means how the closest times and the farthest times away. And we found out that it is moving away from us at about 3.8 centimeters per year. Well, if the Earth is only 10,000 years old, is that a huge difference? No, it's not. But if the world were 4.6 billion years old, it means the moon would have had to start inside the Earth. It obviously never did. And it obviously was never in close Earth orbit, or it would have fell into the Earth.
Well, that assumes that the moon was created at the same time the Earth.
That's a true statement, and that's one of the huge problems they have. Because if it wasn't, then they have to go into some very weird theories. The distance and amount of dust and radiometric dates all give them huge problems. The radiometric dates, again, are anywhere from 1 million up to 14 billion years old and have led to moon capture theories. Now, these things are pure cartoons. Orbit is an unbelievably delicate ballet. You must be in an exact balance between the speed that you're traveling and the direction you're traveling to get into orbit around a planet. And for the moon to just be wandering around the solar system, and where did it come from? Wandering around the solar system and 3 billion years ago fell perfectly into our orbit without hitting the Earth or flying past it is a physics joke. A total physics joke. And because of that, they have now abandoned that. They have now abandoned that, and now their secondary assumption is what's called the big splash. What they now talk about is, evolutionists talk about, is that there was a planet about the size of Mars that 4 billion years ago hit the molten Earth, went through the molten Earth, and part of it came out the other side and created the moon in low Earth orbit, and it's been making its way out ever since. Folks, this is another cartoon. It is a bad explanation because they are trying to force their, what? Worldview upon data that just won't fit for it. Again, the amount of decay we see, the amount of recession we see in the moon orbit today fits very well within a 10,000 year time frame, but fits nowhere within a 4.6 billion year old Earth. And that moon is critical for us. Without the moon, you would have no tides. You would not have our 23 till. Without the moon, the Earth would wobble, and your seasons would be messed up and very erratic. It is the moon that not only circulates the water in our oceans and keeps them from getting turbid, keeps life going within the oceans, it also keeps our seasons regular to where we can have cycles of organisms, cycles for plants and for animals. The moon was placed there with purpose, and we need to see that. I don't have time to go through all the young Earth evidences there are. There's a ton of them. Saturn's rings. It is a complete question as to how Saturn's rings have stayed together. Whenever they do a mathematical or physical computer model of Saturn's rings, they disintegrate within a few million years. But within 10,000 years, no problem. Continental erosion. If the continents have been eroding for the last 4.6 billion years, guess what? There shouldn't be any continents anymore. Winding problem. You ever seen all these beautiful galaxies that make such beautiful spirals? If they're actually 13.72 billion years old, like the evolutionists say, these things actually, the outsides are traveling faster than the insides based on our calculations, and they should be wound to where they are no longer in pretty spirals. In fact, they should be in twisted, tangled messes, unless they haven't had time to wind themselves into those problems yet, because the universe is much younger than the evolutionists would predict. Poynting-Robertson effect. The sun, by its attraction, actually acts to suck all of the debris out of the solar system. It has a nice balance with the planets, keeping them in orbit, but all that dust and junk out in the solar system is sucked up either by the planets traveling through the solar system, or that dust is knocked into the sun. So in 4 or 5 billion years, there should be no interstellar debris. But guess what? Is there a lot of space junk out there? There is, because there hasn't been time for it all to get sucked up. Comet water. Comet water is the wrong type of water. It is theorized by secularists that the Earth got all its water, or most of its water, from comets. But comet water is a special type of water. Does anyone know what type of water it is most of the time? It's a special type of water. We have H2O. They have H2O2. It's a special type of irradiated water called deuterium. When you measure the amount of deuterium in the Earth, it is a small percentage of 1%. We did not get our water from comets. It was placed here at the start. Lava efflux. Are there volcanoes going off all over the world all the time? There are. Well, assuming that, there's a volcano here this month, there was the one there that month, just measuring the amount of lava efflux, the amount of lava that we see spread all over the Earth, we should be able to calculate how many millions of years there has been depositing lava on the top of the Earth. When you measure that, it measures less than 10,000 years. There should be a whole lot more lava flows than there are. Topsoil thickness. If there's been erosion going on when the Mayflower and all those other settlers first got to America, would they have found the thickness of topsoil on the North American continent that they did? Incidentally, the average thickness of topsoil when they arrived here was somewhere between 24 and 36 inches. Because we have uncovered that via deforestation, do we now have much less topsoil today? And we've only eroded that in what? The last 400 years. The moon has short-lived uranium-236 and thorium-230. If the moon was created 3 billion years ago, should it have these very short-period isotopes? It should not. Saturn and Jupiter are cooling fast. If they were cooling at this rate for their whole existence, they can't be 4 billion years old. They must be something less than 10,000 years old. Young faint Earth paradox. If the sun was 5 billion years old, it is theorized that early in its existence it was so faint that it couldn't support life. And so the time period of the last 2 billion years where life was supposed to be developing on this planet couldn't have even occurred because the sun wouldn't support it. Is that any problem if God placed life here in the last 6,000 years and placed the sun at a midpoint in its development? It's no problem whatsoever, but it's a huge problem for evolutionists. We already talked about rate, zircon, helium in the ground. C14 in dinosaur bones. We have found a lot of C14 in dinosaur bones. C14, again, is that chemical that should be gone from any bone within 200,000 years. But the fact that we're finding C14 in dinosaur bones shows that they died far less than that, which is very consistent with a creationist worldview. Eve's mitochondrial DNA. Based upon what we see in our DNA, there's two things we can deduce. One is we all came from how many women? One. Original woman. Mitochondrial DNA shows that, and which supports the Bible. But second, at our current rate, we are currently picking up about 100 mutations in our DNA per 20-year period, what we call a what? Generation. At that rate, we would have picked up the amount of mutations that are in our current genome in about 6,000 to 10,000 years. Ooh, there's those numbers again. For the evolutionists to say that humans have been in their present state of Homo sapien for the last 50 to 100,000 years, they have to assume that each generation is only picking up less than one mutation per generation. Does that fit the data that we actually see? No, it doesn't. They're ignoring that data. Magnetic fields on old planets that we talked about. We have a video over there about that. Human genome decay. Based upon that 100 mutations per generation, if we started with perfect DNA, we would have the amount of mutations we have in our current genome today based upon a 6,000-year-old Earth. Now that's interesting data. Here's some foreboding data. Based upon 100 mutations going into our genome every generation, guess when we will become extinct as a species? In another 6,000 years. We are not moving better. We are not getting better. We are not moving up. We are doing what? Decaying. The second law of thermodynamics is working on our genome.
We'll become monkeys.
Does that tell us then that God's going to come back? And then
It doesn't tell you the day. But it also says it probably won't be in 4 billion years. Incidentally, we have referred at this point to about 70 or more. I haven't described them all, but we've referred to about 70 or more clocks that say the world is what? About 10,000 years old or less. Why is this never heard from in the public schools? Because it doesn't fit their old worldview.
Isn't that amazing? And they say we're the ones who are ignorant and
Right.
blocking.
Because what they're doing is they are not going to deal with data. What they're going to deal with is consensus science. They're going to deal with, well, 95% of scientists believe this, therefore that's what's true. That wasn't true 400 years ago when two guys, Galileo and Copernicus, believed what? The earth revolved around the sun. The rest of the world believed what? That the sun revolved around the earth. Just because they voted for it doesn't make it scientific truth. No. Yes, sir.
So let me see if I got this right. order for life to begin on Earth, the Earth had to be the right distance from the sun, and the moon had to be the right distance from the Earth. The Earth had to be at just the right angle. The atmosphere had to be just right, and then the topsoil thickness had to be just right.
That is correct.
And they had to rotate.
And you've only taken up about 6 parameters out of some 20 or 30 parameters that had to be perfectly balanced, or life could not exist on this planet. This is a beautifully made place that is probably singular in the universe.
It just happened.
It just happened. It just happened. Yes, sir.
With what shot?
The probability is 1 out of 1 quadrillion that all this could occur in just one place. All right. Of all these dating methods, have a consensus around 6,000 to 15,000 years of Earth. The Earth is somewhere between 6 and 15,000 years old based on these 70 different clocks we showed you. And again, this is not going to be shown in schools. Why do ages around 10,000 years keep coming up? Well, it could be because it's the truth. I'm going to go over this very quickly because we're about out of time. Something weird happened to the Earth somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago. And we're going to go through these very quickly. Population growth. Notice in the past 250 years there's been a rapid expansion of human population. Why? Because medical science and nutrition have gotten much better.
And that's even with the over 56 million or more abortions.
Yeah, even with abortions. If you start with 8 people, why would I start with 8 people? How many on the ark? Noah, and project 0.5% growth per year. Now, the actual growth rate that we see in population today is 2% a year. But if you project 0.5% per year over the last 4,500 years since Noah, you will find out that there should be somewhere in excess of 4 billion people on the earth. What's the actual Earth population at this point? About 7 billion. So we're getting a number that makes a whole lot of sense based upon what the Bible says. If you use evolutionary numbers, you start with 2 humans about 1 million years ago and give a 0.5% growth rate, you should have 10 to the 2100 people on the planet. Which means there would be so many people that all continents would be covered foot to foot with people stacked on top of one another into space, filling all of space to all galaxies.
That makes perfect sense.
That makes perfect sense. No, has there ever been that many bodies on this planet? No, there hasn't been time for it. You're getting close in San Antonio.
Well, we weren't humans back then.
Yeah. Niagara Falls erosion rate. Up until recent past, when the top of the Niagara Falls was reinforced with concrete, the water was carving a channel upriver toward Lake Erie at a rate of about 4 to 8 feet per year. The channel is now about 7 miles long. You divide that 4 to 8 feet by 7 miles and you find out that the Niagara Falls is somewhere between 4,500 and 8,700 years old. The age of North America is likely the same. Noah's flood could have eroded half of the 7.5 mile long Niagara River gorge in a few hours as the floodwaters race through the soft sediments. Does this data fit with a flood that occurred about 4,500 years ago? It does. It says that could have been a big event. But that's not the only big event. Erosion rate and the amount of sediment accumulated indicate that it is only a few thousand years old for the Mississippi River Delta. Now, how do they figure that out, that the Mississippi River Delta is only a few thousand years old? Rivers move a lot of dirt. If you've ever seen the Mississippi, it is a huge transporter of sediment down to the sea. When the river reaches the ocean, it slows down and drops sediment to the ocean floor. A delta is built up where the river enters the ocean. A fan-shaped projection of land that builds out farther and farther into the sea, and we call this a river delta. What would happen if this process went on for millions of years? The Mississippi River calculations indicate that its delta would have filled the Gulf of Mexico in just 10 million years, which tells us what? The Mississippi River is far less than 10 million years old, which is contrary to evolutionary time frames. Since the Mississippi Delta now fills only a small part of the Gulf of Mexico, it's obvious the river has not been flowing into the Gulf for many millions of years. At current rates, it would form in about what? 5,000 years, about the time frame when we think the flood occurred. The Nile River Delta in Egypt also gives a calculation of about, guess what? 5,000 years. The Po River of Italy Delta could have developed in only what? A few thousand years. This suggests these rivers have been flowing into the oceans only since a major reshaping of the earth about 5,000 years ago. What happened, do you think, somewhere between 4,300 and 6,000 years ago? The Sahara Desert started to expand at that point. The oldest corals we can find are 4,200 years old. The oldest trees on the planet are 4,300 years old. It's as if the earth started over 4,300 years ago. The oldest written records to date back up only about 6,000 years. We have shown you 9 clocks that say something dramatic happened to reshape the earth 4,300 to 6,000 years ago. What do you think that might have been? There might have been a world-shaping flood, just like the Bible tells us, and we have great archaeological and geological data to support that. Now I'm going to go through a whole lot of stuff here because I'm behind. When people start talking about a local flood, folks, because that's what the people who want to say the Bible is a myth about talking about a worldwide flood, they are saying the Bible is lying. One, not just because it talks about a worldwide flood. What does it say specifically? It says that all of the world's mountains were covered to an extent of what? 15 cubits, which is about 22 feet. What Reasons to Believe and other groups will say is, well, it was just a local flood. So what they're saying is there was a point to where if God is telling the truth, the water was 15 cubits, 22 feet above the mountains, but the water just stopped there. Is this physically possible? No, it's a joke. It never could have occurred. You're either going to believe the Bible, we're talking about biblical authority here, or you're not. And folks, have we already showed you 9 pieces of geologic evidence that say there was a worldwide flood? 2 things occurred which allow this to be easily true. 1, at this point the earth is 2/3 covered by water. It is our belief system that the Himalayas and the great mountain chains of the earth were not formed until the continental movement, which was a result of the flood, and so therefore you had only low rolling hills, not huge mountains at that point. But the second thing that occurred was this. When the huge rains occurred for 40 days and night, it put far more pressure on the continents than it did on the water, on the oceans. And so since it's heaping this huge amount of pressure on the continents, what do the continents do? That landmass is pushed under the oceans. As it's subducted, as they call in geology, as it's pushed under the oceans, what does it do to the ocean floor? It raises the ocean floor, which now pushes that water over the continents and makes a cascading effect of this whole process to where you get a lowering of the continents and a raising of the oceans, which will only come back to equilibrium after those rains recede. A few things in closing. This cartoon shows a lot of what we deal with today. Okay, go ahead, I'm ready to hear about the Bible. But what do they really do? They close their minds. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine. They shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. Folks, do we endure that kind of stuff and see it every day? We do. Colossians 2:8, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principle of the world, and not according to Christ. According to the traditions of men, according to the basic principles of the world. Could they be talking about evolutionary theory right here? And beware. Because it's saying God's not God, that He didn't do it. Folks, there are 2 different types of timelines here. There's the timeline that the Bible describes where 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, the world was created, Noah occurred, this world was reshaped, Christ came into it and gave us a new beginning, and then we have today. But then you have a whole different timeline that's being what? Pushed not only on the public, but on every school child today. And it does not support the Bible. And there's also a 10,000-year timeline, which I'm going to skip over. Hosea 4:6. This is huge. My people are being destroyed for what? Lack of knowledge. The stuff that you have just seen over the past hour, is any of this getting into a public school? Here's what's tragic. Is any of it or most of it getting into Christian schools? No. Is most of this stuff seen in seminary? No. Not most of them. Because we are so into compromise with what's going on there. And look for the penalties. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me. Seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God, I will also forget thy children.
The Pope just came out and accepted evolution.
Is this a continuing struggle? Yes. Now, does that tell 1 billion Catholics you have carte blanche to believe in evolution and that God used evolution?
According to their faith, they're supposed to believe.
Yes.